Hey everyone, I'm going to get right into chapter 8. We're getting there. We have 12 chapters. Um, this looks like a long one, so I'm just going to really get into it. It's called Spies and Allies. So, as we left off last time in chapter 7, Molly convinced Linda and Susan not to knit socks and that they should collect bottle tops instead so that they can be, the metal can be used to make tanks and so on for the troops. And they were invited to Allison's house for a knitting bee, and Susan and Linda thought it was pretty cool, and Molly didn't think so at all. So let's see what we're up to in this chapter. Spies and Allies. Plip, plop, plip, plop, plip. Molly rolled over in bed and opened her eyes to a weepy, wet day. The windows of her room were blurred like teary eyes. Oh no, she thought. What a day to be outside, going door to door collecting bottle tops. Molly got up and put on her spy outfit, dark blue corduroy pants and a dark plaid shirt, and thumped down the stairs to the kitchen. On cold, rainy Saturdays, Molly's mother always made a warm breakfast. She believed children needed food that would stick to their ribs. Today she made thick, hot oatmeal. Why are you wearing that good plaid shirt today? Mrs. McIntyre asked Molly. Mrs. Guilford just ironed it. Why don't you save it for school? I need to wear it today, Mom, she said. I'll be careful. We're working on our project. What project is that? Mrs. McIntyre asked. She put a bowl of oatmeal in front of Molly and another in front of Ricky. Ricky began pouring honey on top of his oatmeal with one hand and filling a glass of tomato juice with the other. It's for school, said Molly. Linda and Susan and I are doing a lend a hand project. Everyone is doing something for the war effort this weekend. There's a contest to see who has the best project. That sounds very worthwhile, said Mrs. McIntyre. Sounds like a dumb elementary school contest to me, said Ricky. He was in the 7th grade. What are you triple dips going to do? Sign up to be monkeys in the zoo? Ricky pretended his spoon was a banana and began to peel it. Ooh, 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 he said, as he scratched the top of his head like a chimpanzee. That's enough, Ricky, said Mrs. McIntyre. Very funny, said Molly. That wouldn't help win the war. For your information, we have a very good project. Yeah, what is it? Ricky asked. I can't tell. Second, guys, I can hear my voice is starting to get raspy. Hold on. Sorry for the squeaky chair. We'll just say it. Okay. I can't tell, mimicked Ricky in a high voice. Well, you don't touch my stuff, Ricky pointed to himself with the hand that was holding the glass of tomato juice. Some of the juice sloshed over the edge of the glass onto his shirt. Ricky clutched at the red stain. Oh, you got me, he said. He jerked his head back, closed his eyes, and slumped off the edge of the chair onto the floor. Dead, he said. Molly giggled. Off with that shirt, young man, Mrs. McIntyre said calmly. That juice will stain if I don't get rid of it right away. As Ricky took off his shirt, Molly rinsed her oatmeal bowl at the sink, dried her hands, and went to the closet to get her school bag, raincoat, and hat. Boots, too, said Mrs. McIntyre, without looking up from the sink. Molly groaned. She didn't think real spies had to wear boots, but she took hers out of the closet and sat on the kitchen floor to put them on. Molly had not used her boots since last winter, and they were a little dusty. The toe of her saddle shoe went in, but no matter how she yanked and pulled and pushed, her whole shoe would not fit inside her boot. She got up and hip-topped over to her mother. Look, Mom, she said, my boots won't go on over my new saddle shoes. I guess I can't wear boots today. Miss McIntyre knelt down and tried to wiggle the boot onto Molly's foot. It would not budge. Well, she said, as she stood up, you can wear these. They're too small for you now. I'll have to get new ones, said Molly. Oh, let me go back. You can't wear these. They're too small for you now. I'll have to get new ones, said Molly. Maybe I can get red boots this year. Mrs. McIntyre stood up. She fastened the top button on Molly's raincoat. I'm afraid not, dear, she said. There's no rubber boots in the stores. I've looked. They're not being made. But why? Asked Molly. Because of the war, her mother said. The rubber is needed to make things for the fighting men. Things like rafts for battleships and life jacket for soldiers. There just isn't enough rubber left over to make red boots for 9-year-old girls. Mrs. McIntyre leaned into the closet. You'll have to wear Ricky's boots today. She held up Ricky's old black boots. My boots? Said Ricky. But Mom, said Molly, they're boy boots. They're ugly. They're... Molly, Mrs. McIntyre interrupted. Think of it as a sacrifice you're making for the war effort. She handed the boots to Molly. Molly sighed. She took the boots. And don't wreck them, said Ricky, or get perfume on them or anything. Molly and her mother had to laugh. Don't worry, I won't, Molly said. She pulled on Ricky's boots. They were clumsy, heavy boots with rusted buckles. The buckles fastened up the front, not on the side like girls' boots. They were a little bit too big, so Molly clumped like a horse as she made her way to the door. Goodbye, Mom, she said. I probably won't be home for lunch. We'll be too busy to stop. All right, said Miss McIntyre. Be careful. Don't go into a stranger's house. Be home by 3 o'clock. Okay, said Molly. She went outside. Linda and Susan were coming up the driveway. Susan waddled like a plump duck under her big red umbrella. My mother made me wear 2 sweaters under my raincoat, she complained. I can hardly move. My mother wouldn't let me wear my dark shirt, said Linda. She didn't have time to wash it. She's been working the late shift at the factory. And I have to wear these horrible boots of Ricky's, said Molly. Oh, well, let's get started. She held up her school bag. I hope this is big enough to hold all the bottle caps, she asked. Can't we take a break? Said Susan. I'm so hot. I'm so cold, said Linda. We can't take a break. We haven't even started yet, said Molly. Come on, real secret agents would have to work in the rain all the time. There were 7 houses on Molly's block. The girls trudged up each one, rang the doorbell, and asked for bottle tops. At the first house, Mrs. Silvano said she didn't have any bottle tops, but did they want old newspapers? They said no, thank you very much. Billy Ruxton answered the door at the next house. He was only 4. He said yes, they did have bottle tops. Then he ran off and came back with a top, still connected to a whole bottle of ginger ale. The girls told him the top had to be off the bottle already, but thanked him very much anyway. They walked to the next house. Mr. Kolaski said he had 2 bottle tops, but he needed them himself. He was a Boy Scout troop leader, and the Boy Scouts were collecting bottle tops for scrap metal too. Finally, Mrs. Keller gave them 6 bottle tops. She had been saving, but had never gotten around to turning in. And Mrs. Lemming gave them 4. She said if they wanted more, they should come back next Saturday, because she was having a party then, and she'd have a lot of bottle tops after the party. By the time they'd gone to all 7 houses on the block, they had cold hands, wet legs, tired feet, and 10 bottle tops in Molly's school bag. Let's count them, said Susan. She handed her umbrella to Linda. What for? Said Linda. We know perfectly well there are only 10. I know, but I want to see them, said Susan. She dug her hands in the school bag and pulled out 2 handfuls. Molly and Linda watched her drop the bottle tops into the bag one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, she said as they clinked against each other. I didn't think it would be so hard to get 100. We'll just have to keep trying, said Molly. We can't give up now. Let's go to the next block. Bottle tops were scarce on the next block, too. No one was home in 2 houses. At one house, a man came to the door in a painter's hat. He was splattered all over with blue paint. He said if he did have any bottle tops, he'd never be able to find them because the whole house was torn up in a mess. The girls peeked past him to see if that was true. It was. One nice lady holding a baby gave them 2 apple juice bottle tops and let them shake hands with her baby. A smiling old lady said they were sweet girls and gave them each 1 bottle top. As they left, Molly noticed 2 blue stars hanging in her window. She has 2 people from her family fighting in the war, Molly said. We have 1 blue star for my father, said Linda. The people next door have a gold star because their son got killed. Molly looked back at the old lady's house. It seemed to be waiting for happy, noisy young people to come back and fill it with fun again. At the next house, a teenage boy holding half a chicken sandwich pulled a bottle top out of his pocket, handing it to Molly, and closed the door without saying a word. Did you see that sandwich? Said Linda. As they headed down the walk, I'm hungry. It's lunchtime. We have to stop now. Not yet, said Molly. We only have 16 bottle tops. I'm tired, said Susan. I can't go any longer. Some secret agents you 2 make, said Molly. Her nose was runny. Ricky boots were heavy. Come on, just 1 more block, and then we'll take a break for lunch. Susan sighed. Linda shivered. Molly led the way across the street to the next block. Hey, you know who lives on this block? Linda asked. Allison Hargate. I know, said Molly. We just won't go to her house to ask for bottle tops. I bet Allison has a lot of bottle tops, said Susan. The girls were now standing right in front of Allison's house. I know what. Let's go peek in the window at the knitting piece, said Linda. It'll be fun, just like real secret agents. Yes, said Susan. Let's spy on them. Molly hesitated. What if someone sees us? She asked. But Linda was already bent over, creeping behind a tall bush and heading toward a big window. Susan put her umbrella in the bush and followed Linda. Molly felt out of place standing on the sidewalk all alone, so she finally went too. When Molly bent over to sneak behind the bushes, the rain dripped down the back of her neck. It gave her goosebumps. Linda and Susan were on tiptoe, holding onto the window ledge, peering inside. Molly looked too. Oh, it was so warm and cozy in there. They were looking into Allison's living room, where a cheery fire blazed in the fireplace. All the other girls in their class were sitting cross-legged in a circle on the rug. They had bright balls of yarn in their laps and long, slender knitting needles in their hands. The Hargate's maid knelt behind Grace Littlefield, her big, capable hands guiding Grace's on the needles. Allison was laughing, and all the other girls looked happy. Look at that tray of sandwiches, said Linda, and cocoa and cookies, too. It looks like fun, said Susan wistfully. The yarn is pretty. I don't see any socks, said Molly. Look, Grace. Can't even hold her needles right, giggled Linda. Well, what have we here? Boomed a voice very close by. The girls jumped. It was Mrs. Hargate, Allison's mother. She was standing right behind them, blocking their path back to the sidewalk. Holding a big black umbrella, drips from the umbrella hit Molly right on the cheek. Mrs. Hargate had on very red lipstick. You girls are late for the knitting bee, said Mrs. Hargate, but that doesn't matter. Come along. Allison was so worried when you didn't get here at 9 with the other girls. She was afraid you weren't coming at all. But I told her that you'd never be so rude. You'd never miss out on all the fun and not help on the project. I said I was sure you'd turn up. I was right. Here you are, Mrs. Hargate kept talking to as she hurried them inside like captured criminals. Linda, Molly, and Susan didn't have time to say anything. Molly didn't know what to say anyway. Before they knew it, the 3 girls were standing in the Hargate's front hall, the water dripping off their coats and forming small puddles around them. Look who I found, Mrs. Hargate called out to Allison in a very loud voice as she took off their coats. Darling Linda, Susan, and Molly were waiting outside. Take off those soppy coats, girls, and the boots, too. Why, Molly, aren't those boots a teensy bit too big for you? Scoot along now. Come on in and join the party. I'll be in the den if you need me. Molly, Linda, and Susan bumped into one another, each trying to be the last one to enter the living room. Allison jumped up from the circle and said, Hi. Hi, mumbled Linda, Susan, and Molly. We were afraid you weren't coming, Allison said. Where are your knitting needles and yarn? She looked behind them as if they might be hiding yarn and needles there as a surprise. We don't have any, said Linda. Oh, well, it doesn't matter, said Allison. I have lots of extra needles, and none of us are used very much yarn. Sit down. I'll get everything you need. Molly, Linda, and Susan sat awkwardly on the edge of the couch behind the circle of knitters. They looked like three cows on a bench. Here, Allison said, as she handed them needles and yarn. I hope the colors are okay, and I hope you're good knitters. We sure need some. How come you're so late? Linda looked at Molly. Molly looked at Susan. Susan twisted a strand of yarn around her finger. Well, she said, we're not doing knitting. I mean, we have another project. Molly jabbed Susan with her elbow, and Susan stopped talking. Allison looked puzzled. You're not making socks? You have another Linda hand project? Molly took a deep breath. We're sort of just visiting you. We're doing a different project. What is it? Asked Allison. It's a secret, said Molly. Oh, Allison went back to knitting. Molly, Linda, and Susan just watched. The other girls knitted silently. Molly noticed that none of the knitters had gotten very far. Most of the girls had knitted only the top part of the sock. They were just getting to the hard part of the heel, where they needed to use 3 needles. What they had knitted didn't look at all like socks. They knitted squares about the size of a doll's blanket. A blanket, Molly sat up on the edge of the couch. That's what they should knit, not socks. They could knit squares, then sew them together to make a big blanket. They practically had enough squares already. A blanket was such a good idea. So much easier than socks. So much faster. But Molly didn't dare say anything. After all, it wasn't her project. Suddenly, Grace Littlefield threw down her needles and looked ready to cry. Everyone stared at her. I can't do this, she wailed. I can't. It was hard enough with the 2 needles, but 3 is impossible. Every stitch I knit comes undone. I'll never make a whole sock, never. Molly felt sorry for Grace. She slid off the couch and sat on the floor next to her. Socks are hard, Grace, she said, but you have a nice square here. If you all put your squares together, you can make a really nice blanket. I saw Mrs. Guilford do it once. See, you just lay out the squares. We're making socks, said Allison. Molly sat back on the couch. Wait, said one of the other girls. Maybe Molly has a good idea. We all have squares already. If we each make just 1 or 2 more, we can make a big blanket. But how do we sew the squares together? Asked Allison. Oh, I know how to do that, said Linda. You don't have to be able to knit to do that. You just need a big sewing needle. Okay, let's try it, said Grace. A blanket is a good idea. Molly jumped up. We should have an assembly line, she said. The best knitters keep knitting. Grace, you collect the squares and flatten them out. Linda, you and I will sew the squares together. I'll finish your square, Grace, said Susan. I'll go find a big sewing needle, said Allison. All of a sudden, everyone was talking at once. The knitters clinking away at their needles, finishing square after square. Grace hurried from knitter to knitter, collecting, flattening, and organizing the finished squares. Molly and Linda sat on the couch. Linda sewed the brightly colored squares together into long strips. Molly sewed the strips together. Slowly, the knitted blanket grew until Molly had to drape it over the back of the couch. Finally, the needles were still. All the girls stood up and lifted the blanket to fold. Susan held one edge up to her cheek. I think this is the most beautiful blanket anyone ever made in the whole world. And we all did it. I don't even remember which squares I made now that they're all together, said Allison. But do you think a blanket can win the Lend a Hand contest? Asked Mary Lou Dobbs. Is a blanket a good war effort? Oh, yes, said Molly. Her fingers were sore where she had picked them from the needle, and her legs were stiff from sitting still so long. Just this week we had got a letter from my dad saying that they really need blankets in the hospitals. It gets pretty cold in England, and winter is coming soon. Just think, said Allison, this blanket may keep some poor wounded soldier warm. It may save his life, Linda added. All the girls looked at the blanket again. I'm sure it'll win the prize, said Molly. Hold on, guys. It's getting raspy again. The girls folded the blanket as carefully as if it were a flag. I'll wrap it in paper so it won't get dirty on the way to school, said Allison. She turned to Molly. A blanket was a good idea, Molly. We couldn't have done it without you. Are you sure? I mean, what about your other project? Could we all help you with that? Molly looked down at her feet. It isn't such a great project, she said. Not like the blanket. And we weren't doing it well anyway, said Linda. What was it? Asked Grace. Susan, Molly, and Linda looked at one another. They all smiled. Oh, it was terrible, said Susan. We were collecting bottle tops for scrap metal, and we knocked on everybody's door. It was so hard. We only got 16, and then we decided to come over here and come over and see what you were doing. Collecting bottle caps is a good project, said Allison. I'll go ask my mother if she has any. If we all ask our mothers, we can get pretty many, said another girl. We wanted to get 100, said Linda. You know what? Said Grace. Her face was shining excited. I live in an apartment building. There are 20 families in my building. We can ask all of them. I bet we'll get 100 bottle tops easily. Yes, and we won't get wet, laughed Molly. Let's go. We only need 78 more, said Allison. My mother had 6. She put the bottle tops in Molly's school bag. Molly smiled at her. Thanks, Allison, she said. Allison smiled too. With a flurry of buckling, zipping, buttoning, and tying, the 10 girls got into their raincoats, boots, and rain hats. They set off for Grace's apartment building. As they splashed on the wet street, laughing and talking and planning, Molly decided that some secrets are a lot more fun when you give them away than when you keep them. 2 days later, Molly cut an article out of the Jefferson Daily News to send to Dad. 3rd grade girls win lend a hand contest. 10 students at Willow Street School showed the true meaning of Allied effort this weekend. The 3rd grade girls won first prize in the school's contest to help the war effort. They knitted a blanket and collected 100 bottle tops, which they made into a sign saying lend a hand. Both projects were a surprise to me, said their teacher, Mrs. Charlotte Campbell. I don't know how the girls managed to finish them in one day. I am very proud of every one of the girls. At a school assembly today, each girl was given a blue ribbon. The blanket will be sent to a hospital in England where Dr. James McIntyre, the father of Molly McIntyre, is working with the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The bottle tops will be given to the Boy Scouts scrap metal drive. The article included a photograph of all the girls, along with Miss Campbell, holding the blanket. Wait until Dad sees this, Molly thought, as she slipped the article into an envelope. Not only was the hospital in England getting a new blanket, they were getting a blue ribbon blanket at that. I just have one thing to say. I used to knit. I'm not a fast knitter. I used to fall asleep. I've tried to make blankets. It's not easy. Anyways, guys, I hope, again, you're enjoying this story. We actually get into, I'll just show you, chapter 9, we get into the Christmas story. So, it looks like we'll be able to finish Molly's Christmas story by the end of the week. And just in time for our Christmas stories. So, guys, enjoy your day. You're awesome. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the flip side. Bye, everybody. Remember, do something kind. Bye.